We are here in Bariloche with Dr. Stanislav Grof. Hello, Stan. It is a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Hello.
According to traditional psychology, non-ordinary states of consciousness are considered pathological. Could you tell us a little bit about the difference between psychotic experiences and mystical experiences, and how do you see that?
Yeah, I was myself trained traditionally. I was, a traditional physician, traditional psychiatrist, and I had Freudian training. So basically I had the same notion that you have today in psychiatry, that every form of non-ordinary state is pathological, with the exception of dreams. If the dreams don't repeat themselves, or if they are not associated with anxiety, then even dreams are seen as pathological. But in current psychiatry, we don't have any distinction between a spiritual and mystical experience. And I started doing my initial work with non-ordinary states with that kind of perspective. And it was basically the experiences and the observations from this work that showed me the absolute necessity to distinguish, that it's simply incorrect to see every non-ordinary form of experience as pathological. You see, we saw initially when we used repeated psychedelic sessions, we saw initially people having Freudian type of experiences. They would be regressing into childhood and reliving some traumatic memories and so on. But the process would not stay there. And then as the process deepened, or we continued with the sessions, then suddenly the process started moving to a completely new area, and people started reliving birth, which according to traditional psychiatry should not be possible. The usual idea is that the brain of the newborn is not mature enough to register somehow the experience of birth. But yet here it was. People were having powerful experiences of being caught, being trapped in this closed system, unable to breathe, and then fighting, struggling, trying to liberate themselves. We saw that people exactly repeated the kind of movements that the child goes through during delivery, related to a particular form of delivery, although they didn't know intellectually anything about the type of birth that they had. They were able to identify that they were born with their feet first at a breech position. They were able to identify that they were born with the umbilical cord around the neck, that there was forceps used. In many instances, they identified the type of anesthesia which was used, or discovered very specific circumstances of the postnatal situation. So suddenly we were confronted with the fact that on the same continuum we have a new category of experiences related to birth. But as people were reliving birth, simultaneously or in a kind of alternating fashion, suddenly these experiences started opening into yet other areas of experiences. So, for example, it seemed that the Jungian type of collective unconscious opened up, both in its historical and its mythological or archetypal dimension. So a person, for example, would be reliving the situation of the fetus who is stuck in the birth canal, and suddenly it starts opening up into experiences from other centuries, where that person is identifying with prisoners in dungeons, or inmates in a concentration camp, or victims of the Inquisition, or any number of situations in which they were victimized, sometimes with a sense of personal remembering. And then people talk about past lives. They not just have the experience of a person in another century, but they have a very convinced feeling that they actually once were that person, that this is not the first time it's happening to them. They are remembering that the same situation already happened to them. Now, in some other instances, it can then open up into the mythological or the archetypal realm. So, for example, people stuck in the womb in a difficult situation can suddenly experience themselves as being in hell, and they have images of devils, and sometimes the hells were specific characteristics of different cultures, because there, different cultures describe hell in a somewhat different way. Or people would identify with figures representing the kind of eternal doom or eternal torture, like suddenly identifying with the mythological figure of Sisyphus or Tantalus or the Flying Dutchman and so on. So suddenly the biological replay of birth was opening up into specific areas of the collective unconscious. And then when the person would continue, then this process would move outside of the biographical and the what I call perinatal, which is the birth-related, and we would get now a very specific type of experiences that we call now transpersonal, in which there would be nothing of the individual history, nothing related to birth, but the person simply would have experiences from other countries, other centuries, past life experiences in a pure form now, not in combination or in alternating fashion with the birth, or just mythological sequences, or encounters with archetypal beings, or identification with archetypal beings, encountering Virgin Mary or the great Mother Goddess from some other culture, or identifying with the dancing Shiva, or having experiences of identification with animals, with different life forms, with absolutely new information coming from these experiences. So what now became important is to identify that these experiences are really authentic, that it's not something that's coming from the movies that people saw, or from books that they have read, or something they were taught at school, and so on. So then I started specifically looking for experiences which provided access to new information. And then I found out that many of these experiences provide access to information that not only the person did not very likely have, but the type of information that cannot be conveyed by the usual channels. For example, the usual movies, books, pictures, and so on can show you what an eagle looks like. You might even hear the eagle, what the eagle sounds like, but they don't show you what the eagle feels like. Now, when people have these experiences, they actually become the eagle. So they have the body image of the eagle. They understand how the eagle flies. They know suddenly how you work with the wind and with the air currents to be able to fly. In some instances, it conveys tastes or smells, experiences which are very specifically animal. You know that this is not something that you would experience as a human. For example, the experience of sexual arousal in a turtle is something very different from a sexual arousal in a human. So you would have these very specific, animal type of experiences. And we don't have media at this point that could convey this kind of quality. Aldous Huxley, in his book, The Brave New World, describes this futuristic form of entertainment called the feelies, where you don't just see things and hear things, but it conveys emotions and conveys some physical feelings. But even then, if we have some virtual reality in the future, we will not be able to convey the feelings of animals because we simply don't have access to them. So this was for me very, very convincing, that the type and the quality of information that was coming through these experiences, was transcending anything that is conceivable through the conventional channels. So then I created this very large cartography where many of the experiences which you read about in spiritual literature have to be acknowledged as normal manifestations of the psyche, not as some kind of pathological products of the psyche induced by some exotic pathology which is yet to be discovered sometime in the future.
the major religions were founded by people that had visionary experiences, and they were generally called psychotics, psychotic experiences. I believe that's an important. Would you talk us a little bit about that? What do you see, or how do you?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very fascinating topic, because if you look at the history of religion, you'll find out that there's no religion that has not started from powerful visionary experiences, what we would call today transpersonal experiences, which are exactly the kind of experiences that I'm talking about. You look at the Buddha, who did 6 years of very extreme ascetic practice, and then had these experiences under the Bodhi tree of first the visitation of Kamamara, the master of the world illusion, with his 3 daughters, and then the experience of the attacking army, and then the experience of the enlightenment itself, and then at a later date the experiences of sequences of past life experiences, where he experienced the liberation from the karmic bonds and so on. The Bible is really full of visionary experiences. Moses seeing Jehovah in the burning bush, and Christ having the experience of temptation in the desert. You can look at the blinding vision of Saul Paul on the way to Damascus. You can think about St. John's apocalyptic vision on the island Patmos in his caves. So the people described in the Bible had communication with God and angels, and they very clearly had these transpersonal visionary type of experiences. There's a description in the Islamic literature of what's called miraculous journey of Muhammad, where he had the vision of Archangel Gabriel visiting him, and then taking him on this miraculous journey through the heavens and through paradise and through hell. And in 7th heaven he had the experience that's described as ecstasy approaching annihilation, where he was given the articles of the Quran, the fundamental articles of the Islamic faith. The same with the Book of Mormons, inspired by direct visionary experiences. So we would not have religions without these kinds of experiences, and yet our psychiatry would put these experiences into the category of psychopathology, and usually very severe psychopathology, schizophrenia or some other type of psychosis. We have many books and articles by psychiatrists discussing what would be the best diagnosis for these people, because these visions are simply seen as hallucinations, which means real distortions of reality that don't have any basis, any legitimate basis. Saint Teresa of Avila was called severe hysterical psychotic. Saint John of the Cross was called hereditary degenerate. Muhammad's visions were attributed to epilepsy, for example. The anthropologists have been having discussions whether shamans should be called schizophrenics or ambulant psychotics or hysterics, or maybe also epileptics, because they have some seizure-like manifestations. And there's even a book about Buddhist meditation. Actually, it's an article by Franz Alexander. So it's an article which is called Buddhist Training as Artificial Catatonia. So the idea that even if you meditate, you're suspect. It is a form of pathology. So this is the official position of materialistic psychology and psychiatry. Now, if this is true, that the great religions were inspired by psychotic experiences and nothing else, then the interesting question is that psychiatrists would have to account for is how come then millions of relatively normal people would get so excited and so inspired about these visions that many of them would sacrifice their life and sort of dedicate themselves to lifetime spiritual practice. You know, how come that what these people were saying inspired incredible art? Look at the architecture, the Gothic cathedrals, the Hindu temples, the Muslim mosques, the beautiful music that was inspired by religion, you know, the beautiful sculptures and paintings and so on. So I think we need a very, very different understanding psychology to present some kind of believable concept of spirituality and religion. So what transpersonal psychology, I think, has demonstrated is that many of the experiences that are part of these visions are really manifestations of the deeper levels of the psyche per se. That they are not some kind of pathological artifacts, and that somehow the need for transcendental experience is a very powerful force in the human psyche. Very likely much more powerful than sexuality, which is what Freud thought. Many people have given up sexuality for spiritual pursuit. Now, that doesn't mean that everything that you find in the world of religion is spiritual or that it is defendable. But I think religion would not have the kind of power that it has over people if it were not based on something that's very real and very very legitimate in the human psyche. The religion has that influence because it somehow talks about transcendental experiences, or even in some instances making a promise of a transcendental experience. Unfortunately, much of organized religion doesn't deliver. We go to church and we listen to somebody telling us about experiences that happened 2,000 years ago. But if in today's church somebody would have a really full-blown mystical experience, your average priest would call the ambulance and take that person to a psychiatrist, because they would believe that that kind of thing doesn't belong in church. I don't know if you saw the movie Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon on the life of Saint Francis of Assisi. What happens when he has a mystical experience? The first thing is he causes a disturbance during the divine service in church. The other one is he takes off his clothes, which shocks other people because he wants to be just sort of, stand in his true nature in front of God. And then he starts giving out the rugs and the carpets that his father is selling. So it would be considered very inappropriate kind of behavior. So it's an example that people have a really powerful spiritual experience. It could be perceived by the environment as disturbing. You have to have a very different understanding of spirituality to be able to not only understand it, but to support it and believe that ultimately it is conducive to healing and transformation and evolution, consciousness evolution.
And from where do you think, Stan, that these people that have these transpersonal experiences or mystical experiences get their information?
Get the reformation?
Their information. In contact with what, or with some, or the collective unconscious, and from where do you think they are in contact with?
Well, the traditional perspective is that the universe essentially is made of matter. The only thing that really exists is matter. The evolution of the universe is the evolution of matter, which is inert, passive, reactive, blind. And that somewhere after billions of years, in a very insignificant part of the universe, then life somehow originates spontaneously, without any guiding intelligence, just by bouncing of atoms, combining into molecules, and then organic molecules, and then organic matter organizes itself into cells, and then you have this development into multicellular organisms, where somewhere the central nervous system develops, and then way up in this evolutionary line, supposedly this miraculous thing happens that matter develops consciousness. becomes aware of itself. Which if you think about it and if you look at it, is basically a metaphysical assumption. It is not a scientific statement, never was. Nobody has ever been able to test it or document it. It is a basic metaphysical assumption. So the idea in this kind of thinking is that the psyche, is a product of matter and exists in a very, very limited part of the universe, which is basically inside of human skull. If some primitive forms of intelligence exist in higher animals, we wouldn't call it psyche. Now, this is a very different image from what emerges out of the non-ordinary states of consciousness. Those observations support something that was formulated by Carl Gustav Jung and his followers, that the psyche somehow permeates all of existence. Our individual psyche is kind of teased out of the universal psyche. We are part of the universal intelligence. That the whole universe, all of creation, is following an intelligent blueprint. The universe is an intelligent creation. It's not that there is the psyche is nowhere except the human skull. It actually, you can think about the universe as all being about consciousness, as all being about psyche, being permeated by intelligence. And so in these transpersonal experiences, you would be getting the information directly from this large matrix, from different aspects of what Jung called anima mundi.
And why do you think people have so few or seldom access to that consciousness? It's because of the defenses, because of what keeps a person so distant or not being constantly in touch with that consciousness?
Well, I think you would be surprised actually how frequent it is that people have the access. But if we live in a society that puts pathological labels on these experiences, that there are many people who have the experiences and can somehow manage on their own, that they keep it for themselves, they don't tell anybody, and just go through these transformative experiences silently. And if they integrate these experiences well, they also develop a sense with whom they can safely talk about those experiences. And they just select people with whom they just never bring up this topic, because they know that those people couldn't understand. And the last people with whom they would talk would be psychiatrists and psychologists, because these people already know what the conclusion would be. They know the position of current psychiatry, that these experiences are not normal. So that's one thing that I think until we have a very open and receptive attitude, we simply will not have reliable statistics. Actually, if you follow, let's say, Gallup poll, about the incidence of mystical experiences, it's constantly growing. And it's very interesting to think about the reasons for this. Is it really that more people have mystical experiences, or are now people more willing to talk about them? People now talk about all kinds of things they didn't talk about. You have, in the United States, I don't know how it is here, but in the United States, people go on talk shows and talk about incest in the family. They talk about their alcoholism and their drug addiction, which was inconceivable before. So there is just more honesty, there's more openness. And also people feel that the atmosphere is changing, that more and more people are now taking a different perspective on these experiences. So it's either, much more of these experiences are happening, or more people are willing to talk, or both.
Or both.
Now the other thing that I would mention in relation to your question is that it's not that difficult for people to have those experiences. We used to work with psychedelics, which are seen as very powerful psychoactive substances. But in the last 20 years, Christina and I and many people whom we trained are now working with very simple means, like a little faster breathing, evocative music and body work. And we see practically daily people having powerful mystical experiences in workshops, in seminars, in our training. So I mean, if all it takes is a little faster breathing and listening to music, we are not that far from those experiences. But again, you know, people have to lose the fear of them and lose the fear from the societal retaliation and the professional sort of suppressive measures before they are going to be willing to open up to these experiences.
You talk, Stani, in your books about a spiritual emergency. Could you explain us what is a spiritual emergency, or talk us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this concept basically comes from our work with non-ordinary states. You know, first I spent, for example, 20 years exploring psychedelic experiences. And then the last about 20 years, or over 20 years, we have been using the breath work. And I will sort of move away from psychedelic experiences and focus on the breath work where it is much clearer. And we see that in groups of people, you know, who are relatively normal, they are not psychiatric patients, they don't have any diagnosis. People who gather for these seminars, for workshops and so on, all it takes is some, you know, faster breathing and listening to music to have many of the experiences that are described in the spiritual literature, and also those that currently psychiatry labels as psychotic. So people have powerful experiences of death, rebirth, of opening to divine light, past life experiences, archetypal, you know, mythological experiences, experiences of oneness with nature, with animals, with God, and so on. Experiences of spirit guides. So if, again, if it takes so little for people who are not seen as psychiatric patients to have these experiences, and if these experiences in the breathwork properly supported can be healing and transformative and evolutionary, that obviously, you know, creates the question, is this not true also for experiences that happen in people in everyday life? Experiences that involve exactly the same kind of themes. So basically it turned out that after having done a lot of work with the breath work and earlier with the psychedelic experiences, we simply could not share the old perspective according to which people who have these experiences have to have some kind of serious exotic pathology that is yet unknown, but that will be discovered sometime in the future. And it was very logical to start applying the same kind of strategy to these states. So instead of giving people tranquilizers, we would just encourage them to go into the experience, and you find out that they can get actually through it to better mental and physical health and to better functioning. Okay? So out of these kinds of observations came then the concept of spiritual emergency. It's really a play on words, because the Latin term emergere means emerging, and you know the English term emergency means a crisis, emergency room, and so on. So if you say spiritual emergency, it supplies somehow the image of a crisis, of a problem, but at the same time it has this element of emerging, emergere, in it. We frequently refer to the Chinese language, where you have a sign which is for crisis, and it juxtaposes danger and opportunity. We believe that this is true for these states as well. So we have now worked with quite a few people in these spontaneous crises. We call them, you know, spiritual emergencies, or psycho-spiritual crisis, or crisis of spiritual opening. And we found out that the results are much, much better than with the traditional suppressive therapy with pharmaceutical with pharmaceutical agents. So we wrote a book called Stormy Search for the Self, which describes this concept and also discusses the strategies, how you understand and how you support these kinds of states. And we put it in a very, very broad historical framework, starting from shamanism, going through the Aboriginal rites of passage, discussing the ancient mysteries of death and rebirth and the different spiritual traditions and how some of these states are discussed and seen in those contexts. So, for example, the phenomenon of shamanism is very, very closely linked to not only to non-ordinary states, but to crisis involving non-ordinary states. The career of many shamans begins by a spontaneous episode of a visionary state, which is described by anthropologists as either shamanic crisis or shamanic disease, depending how pathological their perspective is on these states. But the fact is that these people very frequently are sick. They have various emotional, psychosomatic, or even physical disorders. And then in this powerful visionary experience, they have a sense of traveling into the underworld, being subjected to various ordeals, being attacked by evil spirits and so on, then have the experience of annihilation, sometimes dismemberment, and then getting a new body, being sort of resurrected, and then there is a sense of a magical flight, being transformed into a solar bird like an eagle or a falcon or thunderbird or condor, or being carried by a solar bird into the solar realm, into the celestial realm. And then in this kind of process, they develop deep connection with the animal world, with the world of archetypal animals or power animals, with the forces of nature. And they get kind of a crash course in healing. They get insight as to how blockages of energy underlie different disorders and how you can work with energies so that it's conducive to healing. And then if they integrate these states well, then they become healers, they become seers, basically priest healers of their people. So we have this major example of how a state which initially appears to be disorganizing actually is conducive to greater health and to superior functioning, even in social roles. Similar kinds of experiences happen in so-called rites of passage, which are powerful rituals enacted at certain important biological or social transitions in these native cultures, where a group of initiates, for example, people in puberty, young adolescents in puberty, would be taken through a powerful ritual using mind-altering techniques of various kinds, and they experience a powerful sequences of death, rebirth again, psychospiritual transformation, and it's interpreted as dying in the old role and being born into the new one. For example, in this puberty rite, the idea is that girls and boys died and adult men and women were now born, and it's an absolutely clear sort of separation line between the adolescent population, children, and the adults. Another very important institution that you can refer to when you want to support somehow historically the concept of this kind of a healing crisis, transformative crisis, would be the ancient mysteries of death, rebirth. There are many cultures who have death, rebirth mythologies, mythological stories featuring deities, demigods, heroes who either died or were killed and dismembered and then were reborn in a new function, or they experienced some kind of an alternative to this, like descending into the underworld, visiting the realm of the dead, and returning, or being swallowed and regorged, like Jonas, for example, or Saint Margaret, or or Jason, devoured by the dragon and so on. And then in many cultures there were institutions that involved kind of initiatory procedures, where again group of neophytes of these initiates were subjected to some powerful mind-altering procedures which involved a powerful death rebirth experience, and that was experienced as identification with the deity representing death rebirth. So for example, in ancient Sumer there is the story of Inanna and Tammuz. Inanna had a lover, Tammuz, who died, and now she is going into the underworld, into the realm of death, trying to find elixir of life to bring him back to life. Orpheus, returning into the underworld for Eurydice. The story of Osiris, killed and dismembered by his brother, and then put together by his two sisters, Nephthys and Isis, and becoming the ruler of the underworld. Or another powerful story is the story of the hero twins in the Mayan culture, who were invited into the underworld by the gods of the underworld, and they played ball game with them and died and were reborn and actually transformed into celestial bodies, or Quetzalcoatl in the Aztec, in the Nahuatl tradition, who was given alcohol by the goddess of pulque, of a certain kind of alcoholic beverage, and committed incest with his sister, and then punished himself by immolation. And there's a beautiful description in the Codex Borbonicus, one of the Aztec codices, of his journeys through the different realms of the underworld, and then emerging, transformed into the planet Venus. And probably the most influential story is the story of Persephone, who was abducted by Pluto into the underworld and then had to be cyclically returned at the request of the gods, because the vegetation was being destroyed when the goddess was not present. So in all these places they enacted these powerful rituals in which people were experiencing these sequences of psychospiritual death and rebirth. Now in Greece and in the whole Mediterranean area, these mysteries were particularly popular and very, very important. If you look at the list of the participants in these mysteries, it reads like who is who in antiquity. We have in the United States these books, who is who, that lists all the important people. So for example, Plato and Aristotle were both initiates in these mysteries, and they wrote about them. Aristotle's term catharsis comes from the mysteries, the idea that we should experience somehow this powerful instinctual activation and emotional discharge, catharsis, and that it's conducive ultimately to greater order, that we feel happier and we can get along better with other people, we contribute more to society, and so on. Plato also wrote about these mysteries and considered them very important. And from the perspective of the spiritual emergency concept, it's interesting that Plato actually distinguished two types of madness. One was the ordinary madness, which he linked actually to the body. It was the disease that could be explained from normal causes. And then he distinguished another form of madness, which is called divine madness. And he described 4 different forms of this madness, which was actually caused by possession by certain deities. Today we could say with Jung it was a possession by an archetype. One of them was the erotic madness, which was the craziness of the lovers who do all kinds of strange things when they fall in love. They can act almost like insane. The second one was what he called the prophetic madness. Like the example would be Pythia, who goes into this very, very strange, unusual states, but also has access to extrasensory perception, can sort of predict the future, has the gift of clairvoyance in that state, and so on. Then he talked about the artistic madness. When an artist has a powerful inspiration, they can act as if they were insane. And so there were subgroups in this group of the artistic madness. And there was basically possession by the different muses, depending on which form the artistic inspiration took. And the last form of madness is the most interesting for us. He called it stylistic madness or ritual madness, which was the controlled madness in the mysteries. Then people would go and they would, for example, in the Bacchanalia, drink wines, and we know today that these were wines with powerful admixture of psychedelic substances. And then they would run into the countryside, they would take off their clothes, they would chase animals, they would taste raw flesh and blood and so on. And then there would be a sexual orgy. And when all the aggression and the sexual impulses were kind of dissipated, then there was an experience of union with the deity, with Dionysus. So people like Aristotle and Plato believe that this madness, this measured, this controlled madness in these mysteries is ultimately conducive to order, that we harbor certain dangerous tendencies, and that unless we find ways of processing them and sort of taming them, that they will be a disturbing factor in the human society.